estás? Justamente. Vamos a mandar de 30 años entonces Pablo
I'm sorry to pass it.
y Pablo después sí, pero viene martes, pero yo creo que no sé hasta sí, no me mandó una nota diciendo que iba a estar no tengo sobre su estado. Ah, sí, ¿hasta cuándo va a ser? No, pero la pregunta es ¿hasta cuándo se va? Porque si está esta semana entrando, no solamente sí, claro, sí. Ya. Ah, sí. Okay, perfect.
First day was like baked goods. 2 or 3 days. Then she'd sit at the desk and she would start make sure she did not she was like
we're missing one of our panelists here, but as soon as he makes his appearance, we'll start. Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Jeff Thale from WOLA, the Washington Office of Latin America. Thank you to all of you for coming to this event just before Easter and taking your time to do this. This event is co-sponsored by WOLA in collaboration with American University Center for Latino and Latin American Studies. We're delighted to be collaborating together, and in fact, 3 of our speakers are one way or another connected with the center at AU, so that's a real pleasure for us. The event is being live streamed, and anybody who's watching can use the Twitter hashtag to send in questions or comments that we'll use in the course of the event. Normally, our senior associate for citizen security, Adriana Beltran, will be chairing this panel. I'm happy to report that she's on maternity leave and has a 5-day-old child. She may be watching it on the live stream. So this event is to take a look at the uncertainties, the challenges, and the opportunities a year after the gang truce in El Salvador. As most people here know, in March of 2012, the 2 negotiators, Monsignor Colindres with the Catholic Church, with the Army Chaplaincy of the Catholic Church in El Salvador, and Raul Mijango, a former FMLN commander former advisor to the Minister of Justice and Public Security, negotiated a truce between the leading members of the largest cliques of the Mara Salvatrucha and the 18th Street Gang. To the surprise of many observers, that truce has endured for what's now a year. The truce has, although the elements of the truce, the role the government played in the truce, the various pieces involved in the dialogue and facilitation that led to the truce are still pretty obscure to most people. And the extent of the government's leadership in the process is still a subject of a lot of discussion. It is clear that the truce has lasted a year, and it's clear that the truce has brought crime rates, homicide rates in particular, down significantly. At the time of the truce, homicide rates in El Salvador averaged 12 to 13 a day. Today, the average is about 5. And that's undoubtedly a huge and important drop in the crime rate and has real potential for affecting the daily lives of Salvadoran citizens. As we'll hear in the course of the event, that's not to suggest that broader issues of crime and criminality have been addressed, and there are a lot of uncertainties that face us yet. What we have here, I think, today is an opportunity to look at the truce and a little bit about how it was negotiated and what's known and not known about it, the current political situation in El Salvador vis-a-vis the truce and the problems of crime and criminality, a comparative perspective on gang truces in other countries, both in the United States and in the Caribbean, and finally an opportunity to look at, despite all the problems and uncertainties, what might be the opportunities for investment in reinsertion, rehabilitation, violence prevention programs. So we have 4, we're really lucky to have the 4 speakers we have. I think we'll begin with Hector Silva, a journalist and former diplomat, now a fellow at the Center for Latino and Latin American Studies. We'll follow that with Steve Dudley, the co-director of Inside Crime, also a fellow at the center at AU, who will talk about some of the exploration and work he's done on the role of the church in this process. We'll move to Ed McGuire from American, who will talk about comparative experiences. Ed has worked on crime and violence issues and truces in Trinidad and Tobago, and looked some at those issues in gang truces in the United States. And finally, we'll have Alice Willman from, who's a social development specialist from the World Bank and who's looked at urban violence issues throughout Latin America, talk a little bit about what might be the opportunities and possibilities for the donor community. So we'll try and give each speaker about 10 minutes, and then we want to leave plenty of time for questions and discussions about what's a very complicated, interesting, and controversial issue. And let me pass the mic along to each of the speakers in turn. So, Hector.
Okay, thank you. What I'll try to do is I'll try to make a picture of what's happening now after a year with the truce and what does the truce means now for Salvadoran day-to-day reality. I would say the first and foremost obvious thing is what Jeff said in terms of homicide figures. That's undisputable. Although there's some doubts about the exact figures, I think no one can question that there are far less homicides now in El Salvador than there were 1 year ago. And that's due to the truce, period. Other crime figures, what's the reality on other crime figures? It's basically the same. And that is important because extortions, for instance, are a day-to-day reality, especially in the very same neighborhoods in which the gangs operate. There are a number of neighborhoods in urban El Salvador, especially in suburbs surrounding the main cities, San Salvador, Santa Ana, San Miguel, that are gang territories in which extortion is still a day-to-day reality. And the gangs have made clear that despite the truce, that they're going to keep extorting because that's what they do. And unless they have another choice, of making a living, they will keep doing this. So extortion figures are still the same, and this is something that hit these communities very hard. So in terms of that kind of figures, the reality is still the same, but more beyond the figures, there is what's happening in day-to-day life. We hadn't had a picture of that so far, because we had been focused, even in El Salvador. Keep in mind that we have a number of different realities in El Salvador. You know, we're still one of the more one of the countries with more inequities, social and economic inequities in Latin America. So the realities of these suburbs have nothing to do with the realities of uptown San Salvador. So what's happening in these neighborhoods in which the gangs have lived and developed was and had been unknown for a lot of from the elites, middle class, and the elites in San Salvador. And we didn't know really what was happening after the truce was brokered in these neighborhoods. There was a piece written a couple of weeks ago in El Faro by journalist Carlos Martinez about the day-to-day life in Ilopango, one of the San Salvador suburbs. The title is Ilopango Against Its Shadows. And it tells you a really compelling and thorough story of what's happening there. This is a story of fear, mistrust, but also a story of hope. It tells you a story about a community that's been looking over its shoulder for 20 years because of the presence of this reality. Gangs and gang members are, gangs are sons of these communities. These communities have lived with gangs forever. And the killings, the homicides were happening there. They're not happening anymore. And the people that are sources and that speak in this story talk about this. And they say, yes, we are not longer seeing dead bodies in the streets. But we're still living with fear of, going out knowing that we have to pay the renta, to them. And when this journalist talks to gang members, they say, well, I still carry my piece because I need to protect myself. And I don't know if tomorrow I will have to defend myself from the other homie or the other gang member or the police. At the end, and I know this journalist, and when he was talking to me about this piece and asked me what sense do you get from reading this, and I said that the word is fragile. This is a fragile piece, and that's the thing. That's the essence of it. And here's where politics comes in. What would it take to make this reality brokered by gang leaders and some state agents in an obscure manner become public policy and something that's worth making a government policy? Well, we don't know yet. Because one of the things here is that we don't have leadership here. For this to become something that would really change the face of my country, we need leadership, and we don't have that. I mean political leadership. What we have had so far is, and this is controversial, but it is what it is. We've had the goodwill of gang leadership. Whatever reasons they had, they put them on the table and talk to a couple guys that the Minister of Security sent and say, okay, let's broke something here. Here are conditions. What are yours? Their conditions were plain. What we offer is that we will tell our homies not to stop the killing. That's it. We will stop extortions. We will stop drug dealing. We will stop the killings. What do we want? We want you to put us in jails with less restrictions. We want you to tell the police to come down with us. That means stop, come down with the surveillance in the streets. Let our homies be in the neighborhoods. And we make this clear to you. We will keep our business open. What does that mean? We will keep engaged in some sort of crime endeavors. That is, again, extortion mainly, and also some other things like small drug dealing. That's what they brokered. That's what they agreed on. Do we know this because they told us so? No. We know this because that's what we've learned from the streets. Yes, the killing stopped, or at least dropped, and they went to another type of jails, and those crimes kept going. Then we enter the second stage of this, because another level of the state, meaning the municipalities, stepped in those territories in which gang presence was heavy, mainly the suburbs of San Salvador, and said, well, we went in and we propose to create what's called municipios libres de violencia. Let's create something here. So there was a lot of noise, presentations, and one thought, well, here's the state policy. Now, the dark chapter's over, and there was a lot of talking, even comparing this to the peace accord, by saying, yeah, well, let's forgive and forget, and let's see if we can take this to another level, another stage, and put together something that could really mean a different situation to these municipalities. Of course, that would, again, that would have need leadership, statehood, funding. So that's what we thought. Some 3 months ago, we heard about 16 municipalities getting into this plan. We saw majors talking about this. We heard about international donors stepping in. We heard some state officials, other than the negotiators, talking about asking the president to budget this. We heard presidential candidates talking about studying the issue. Nothing happened. Last thing we heard is one of these majors screaming in desperation to his party, the Arena party, saying, hey, I'm alone here. What are you talking about? Asking the president, hey, this is your creation. Even though you don't recognize it, this is your creation, but I'm alone here. You need to change the laws. Because if I am willing to deal with gang members, according to Salvadoran law, these guys, as the Salvadoran law states now, these guys, for the merely fact of being part of a gang, they're criminals. So I'm dealing with criminals. So if we're going to pursue this, we need to change the law. That takes political will. Who's going to do that? I need money. And if you read this piece that I talked about in El Faro, it's not millions of dollars for to start. What these guys in Ilopan were asking, and we're talking about one of or some of the most powerful cliques. They're asking a supermarket to buy chicken. That's what they grow in a farm they have. 6 months. I don't know what kind of money that is. But, and I will finish with this. If this is an opportunity, despite the obscure things, the hidden agendas, what El Salvador needs is leadership. Someone to grab this, own this, and say, well, yes, this happened. I see a chance here. I will take this, make it mine, and try to make this public policy in order to fix this problem. What does that mean? Well, face what's wrong with this, because there's a lot of things that are wrong with this, and try to take advantage of what could be right. Facing what's wrong means taking a lot of political risks, and we're facing an electoral year. So, who is the one that could take this? The President of the Republic. No one else. And I don't see that happening. So that takes me to conclude that, sadly, the fragility will continue, that this will stay in the hands of the leadership that owns this now, meaning gang leadership, which, take care of them. They will take care of them, their own, and that means putting the word out, stop the killing, that will continue, but also keep the other endeavors going. And that's not good news for Salvadoran people. But also the brokers, and there's a lot of questions about the brokers. And there's another open question on how other types of crime or criminal organizations are engaged or using these tools for their own purposes. That's another discussion. So without leadership, that will still happening. That fragile space, reality will keep going, and it will take one killing one event to start again the whole chain of retaliations that will bring the whole thing up again. That has started already. March the 2nd, from the jails. This is what wasn't supposed to be happening anymore. From a jail in Izalco, one clique leader ordered one of his own to kill another gang member that was in jail in a police precinct, to kill him because he was a witness in a number of drug dealing endeavors that had to do with the gang, with the clique. The truce was in place. This happened within a police precinct, first time in Salvadoran history, in the midst of the truce. This is not good news. So, fragility. That's the word. Without leadership, that's what will still happen. And in the political side, politicians will do with this what they did with the Mano Dura thing. They will use this as political line for the coming campaign. And we all know what happens when this happens. How these things turn out. I heard former Honduran President Maduro saying back in the day, I was elected because I invented mano dura. Look what's happening in Honduras, right? We could hear a lot about the truce in the midst of a heavy, intense electoral campaign in El Salvador. But without leadership, without real policy, I'm not optimistic of expecting something good out of it.
Thank you very much. So, a portrait of a truce that's negotiated by a set of brokers and on a set of issues, not entirely clear all of the pieces of that and how that's played out. The result is a very fragile situation, but also a moment where there might be opportunity with leadership to sort of move things forward. So with that, Steve, do you want to talk about brokers and history a little bit?
Yeah, first, thanks Jeff and Wola, and a very special thanks to American University and the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies, who about 3 years ago this time, Eric Hirschberg, who's in the audience, and I started talking about housing inside crime there, and they've been great ever since. They've been a great home, a great support, great institutional support, so I want a special thanks to them. This is, look, there's a ton to unpack here. I got a lot of papers here. I'm not going to go through them all, but there is a ton of things to unpack here. I'm going to focus on one particular aspect, which I think is kind of a broader question that go beyond a little bit of the questions of the economics and politics, and it's sort of a moral question at the heart of this. And the study that I was, that actually Inside Crime was commissioned by the center to do as part of a larger series of studies on religion and conflict that they'll be publishing over the next several months. So I urge you guys to keep an eye on those. They run throughout the whole region. So this is just one paper. And the central question of this paper was, what was the role of the Catholic Church? Exactly what did it do? I did this paper in conjunction with Oscar Martinez, who runs Sala Negra, the wing of El Faro that follows organized crime. Obviously, those are the guys who broke the story. They're the guys who are getting in inside out of the jails. They're the ones who are, doing these tremendous stories about the sort of next phases of the truce. So, these are the guys in the know. We interviewed a number of clergy members, gang members, government. We interviewed the government negotiators and brokers on this. And what do we find? First, a couple things to keep in mind. One is the history of the Catholic Church in El Salvador. I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with it, but let's just call it tumultuous. A church that has been, in the simplest of terms, divided into sort of two major sections. One would be a more traditional clergy with a more traditional approach, much more sort of, let's call it humanitarian in nature. Another would be a bit more of the radical side that included a number of clergy who were involved in liberation theology, and a number of whom got in trouble for a lot of their activities, including obviously the most famous, the assassination of Archbishop Romero in 1979. So you've got this church that has these sort of two sides to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is the gang's history and the gang's origins. The gangs are not guerrilla groups. They're not organizations that stem from a sort of political origin or have these sort of very clear political goals. Certainly they have social and economic and even political reasons for being and for emerging, but they're looked upon not as a political actor. They might be trying to change their rhetoric now, but they're looked upon as predators, not as liberators within Salvadoran society. So it's important to keep those two things in mind. How did the church get involved? Well, I think before we get to how they got involved now, and this will be brief background, but you should know that the church has been working with gangs for a very long time, both the Catholic Church and many, many strands of the evangelical churches there. And the evangelical churches, to a certain extent, have a better relationship with the gangs than the Catholic Church traditionally does. The Catholic Church has gone through the window of working with gangs in a humanitarian way, mostly in providing assistance in prison conditions. So this is the window through which they have entered into this work. There are others who are doing a lot of work outside of this. Catholic Relief Services would be the one I would mention, probably the foremost one, and doing prevention work and whatnot. And then there are pieces of the church that have tried to bring in pieces of gang members or pieces of gangs and sort of reintegrate them into society. The most famous of which is Father Antonio Rodriguez, who ran a program and still runs a program in a poor neighborhood in San Salvador, and was really the first guy to explore this before we have this current truce. And it's interesting because he's more from the progressive wing. He's more of the idea of the church as an agent for social change. And so he comes from the sort of liberation theologist wing and was brought in 2009 to work with the government and begin to sort of test the waters a little bit. And so there were a lot of discussions around these very same issues that they're having now back in 2009. And they even reached a temporary agreement, which lasted about 2 months. It then fell apart. Of course, it was not publicized as such at the time, but it was essentially a sort of prelude to the current truce. It was brokered by this part of the church, this sort of liberation theologist part of the church. Now we have a new itineration of a government. Within the security ministry, there were lots of changes. In 2011, they started to bring in ex-military folks to run the security ministry, which many people challenged on a legal level. And so more of a right-wing shift within the government also brought in now a second effort to negotiate with the gangs. And this was run through more the security ministry side. And it was run through an ex-guerrilla named Raul Mijango. Raul Mijango was, he was a person who was influenced himself by liberation theologists. He was a congressman at a certain point, was also accused of crimes and actually thrown in jail for a while, which gave him a certain amount of street cred to actually work with the gangs. So he became this sort of go-between between the security ministry and the gangs during this time period. The negotiations moved quickly, probably more quickly than they expected. That's probably because there was some prelude to this. They had already been talking about this for a long time. And at a certain point, they realized that they lacked something very important in this, and that was moral authority. They didn't have the moral authority to actually pull this off in front of the Salvadoran society. They needed some institution behind them, preferably the Catholic Church, the traditional moral authority in the country behind them to push this deal forward. So they began to go around to different parts of the Catholic Church. They went to the Bishops' Conference first, of course, and tried to talk to a number of them and get them to be involved. And they said no. In fact, 4 guys said no, before they finally came around to this Bishop Fabio Colindres. Now, who is Colindres? Colindres is the military chaplain. He's from more the traditional wing of the church. He's a guy who has had contact with the sort of police and military units. In fact, his office is in a military barracks in San Salvador. So this is a different wing of the church that they have brought in and tried to essentially legitimize this process, or at least bring him in and have him as a sort of institutional broker. So along with the sort of civilian guerrilla broker, you've got an institutional broker who has the moral authority, or theoretically the moral authority, in front of the Salvadoran society to push this forward. So these are the actors who are involved, and this is the context in which the church becomes involved. Now, there are 2 interpretations of why the church gets involved. Colindres, of course, would emphasize the humanitarian side. He focuses much more, and his theology as well is much more focused on the sort of John Paul II type of theology, Mother Teresa. He brings in, of course, Archbishop Romero, because everyone who talks about religion in El Salvador brings in Archbishop Romero. But I would say that his argument is much more along the lines of, we are a humanitarian exercise, but in a sense of charity. We are a conflict resolution organization, but in the sense that we give humanitarian assistance, as opposed to the other wing of the church, which is we are interested in conflict resolution, but through social change. So you can see there are two different types of churches that are going at this, which goes from the history of the church itself. And the question is, are these compatible? Because immediately with this interpretation and with his involvement, you have got divides in the church. And these divides pretty much run along these lines that I'm describing for you. This sort of, let's call it the sort of more progressive wing of the church, and then also you've got the more sort of traditional wing of the church. The other interpretation of this is that the church was essentially there, as I argued earlier, was to provide legitimacy. That the only reason that they brought in the church was to provide legitimacy. And this position was actually stated by the negotiators themselves to Alfaro in a story that came out last year. And they said essentially, look, when the church comes in, we know we are going to have the attention of both Salvadoran society, but also Salvadoran elites. We have to think about this process as a multi-year process in which we have to bring in various sectors and make sure that they are involved over a long period of time. I'm talking mostly about the business sector. So this is a very important thing. Now, when I talked to Colindres about this and I asked him about, okay, basically, Bishop, they're saying that you were used, he was obviously bristled at that. This was something that made him very angry to think that anyone would use the church, and that it is on their conscience if they are using the church for this purpose. In other words, as a way to legitimize this process. Why is this all important? I think it's important because every peace process involves a bit of a deal with the devil. So you always need to create or establish some sort of way in which you can have this deal with the devil, in which this deal with the devil is legitimized. How do you do this deal with this particular actor who has no political origins, who everyone looks, or most people look upon as a predator? How do you do this without bringing in somebody like the church? And this is the big question that the peace process is facing now. Can the church, or is Colindres, who is actually now the sort of only thing left in the church, or the sort of sole representative of the church and face of the church, is this actor strong enough to sort of convince Salvadoran society that they should make this deal with the devil? Now, I use that very loosely because obviously the gangs have a lot of different origins. I recognize those as well. But this is the essence of the issue. And the interesting thing, and I'll just sort of finish up on this, is how the gangs themselves then see this as well. First, just quickly, the gangs come from, obviously, a religious background. Most of their families are Catholic. They've grown up in this atmosphere of, that the Catholic Church is this sort of, moral high ground or institution. Some of them, look at that, they sort of see the progressive wing in a favorable light. Some of them see the Catholic Church maybe as more of sort of a representation of the elite. But they all think of themselves as religious in a certain way. And when I spoke to one of them in the jail, essentially, I asked him, are you religious? And he said, yeah, well, look at this. He opens up his chest or his shirt, and underneath he's got an entire tattoo of Jesus Christ on his chest. So they have a very strange relationship, with religion and with the church. And they have also a strange relationship with how they're being perceived right now and how they perceive themselves. And I would say they have this dichotomy that they're facing. On the one hand, they know that they are victimizers. They know that they're predators. And on the other hand, they think of themselves as victims. And the church, to a certain extent, is going to also sort of be the representation of that. They're going to be the ones that are going to be able to sort of meld those two ideas together. Because if you think about the whole idea of the church, you're able to be pardoned, etc. So this is an institution that is going to play a role on this level, on this sort of moral authority level. So I'll welcome your comments and questions afterwards.
Great, thank you, Steve. Just before we move on, just to say that the government of El Salvador has a technical commission to try and develop proposals for consolidating the truce. There's certainly a lot of questions and challenges about that commission, but I understand it will be here the week after next, and Monsignor Colindres, Raul Mijango, the Justice and Security Minister, and others will be, I think, here in DC for almost a week, and I assume there will be a number of opportunities, both public and private, for people to meet with them and follow up on a lot of these questions. So what I think we've done here is heard both about the situation of the truce today and about some of both the origins and some of the brokers of the process. I think what we're going to do now is turn to Ed to talk about comparative experiences. Ed McGuire is a professor of Law, Justice, and Society. Is that
Justice, Law, and Society.
Justice, Law, and Society? I tried. And has written a lot. Has worked as well, not only a professor at AU and George Mason and the University of Nebraska. Has consulted with both the UN and the Department of Justice, and has written extensively on crime and violence. And so, the floor is yours.
Thanks. So I'm coming to you today from a very different perspective. First, with regard to truth in advertising, I am not at all an expert in this region. In fact, I know very little about it. I'm here today in my role as a criminologist and as somebody who studies gangs, and in particular, someone who studies gang truces. I came to this idea of gang truces in kind of a nonlinear way. As a criminological generalist, I knew something about gangs. We know something about lots of different crimes as criminologists, but I certainly didn't consider myself a gang expert. But I was brought to Trinidad primarily for my expertise in police organizations, police organizational change, and justice sector reform and these kinds of issues. And I had worked quite a bit on homicide issues, on police organizational change, and on the marriage between the two of them. And so this was the background that led me to Trinidad and Tobago a number of years ago. And when I arrived there and began our diagnostic process to try to understand exactly what was going on with this pretty serious outbreak of violent crime that small nation was experiencing at the time, very quickly sort of arrived at the conclusion that this was a street gang violence issue. And also realized that I was a bit out of my element and called in some genuine experts on street gangs from the US. And the process sort of unfolded from there. One of the things that became very clear to me with the help of some other members of my team was that the solution to the problem of gang violence in this country needed to be something much larger than whatever would emanate from changing the police service, the courts, the crime lab, and these kinds of justice sector reforms that were my bailiwick. And so that very naturally led us to begin working with the faith community. And so we very quickly ended up finding a parish priest in a very violent gang neighborhood this was a really brave guy who basically, when the shooting would start, he would sort of head toward it while everybody else was running away from it. And as he put it, he had made his peace with God and was determined to do something about this problem. And so he ended up getting involved in a lot of mediation work with gang members, and a lot of these mediation efforts were sort of miniature truces in the sense of getting person A not to kill person B in that moment, in that time. This wasn't intended to be some sort of lasting truce, just forestalling violence for the moment. We ended up forming a partnership, and one of the questions, this priest was something of an intellectual himself, and one of his questions was, what do we know about reducing gang violence, community-led efforts to reduce gang violence from the rest of the world, which led us to really sort of delve into the literature on that topic. And what I discovered to my dismay is that my industry, the criminological industry, was exceedingly pessimistic when it came to what can communities do. I'm not talking about justice sector efforts, but community civil society type efforts to address gang violence. There was a lot of literature on it. But as a social scientist, most of it didn't pass muster. It was highly anecdotal, almost kind of emotional and over-involved, and not really sort of very detached, certainly not very systematic. And what systematic evidence there was largely suggested that virtually everything that had been tried didn't work. So this priest and I put together this group of faith leaders from multiple faiths, because these were multi-faith communities. And we began working together to start thinking through what we could do to deal with gang violence. We had Hindus, Muslims, various pieces of Christianity, and even a Rastafarian in the room, and trying to sort of meld these people together in terms of working on this gang violence issue in this very small community. One of the things that we ended up doing was bringing to the attention of this group, all the people in this room were involved in some way or another in informal efforts to deal with gang violence. One of the things that we ended up doing was bringing to them, I sort of felt like a college professor, bringing to them reading assignments essentially on what had been learned from other efforts to deal with gang violence. And I'll sort of circle back to this at the end of my talk, but what the major theme in these readings was that a lot of the mediation efforts that take place serve to increase gang cohesion, serve to increase gang legitimacy. And we don't know this for a fact, but we think we know this as criminologists, that as we increase cohesion within gangs, and as we increase legitimacy of gangs by virtue of working with them as formal entities, and especially exposing them to the media and to high-level politicians and these kinds of efforts, that we can inadvertently plant the seeds for long-term increases in crime. So this is what we thought we knew, and so you can imagine me as a professor sitting around this table with people from the faith community, where I'm suggesting to them that much of what they were doing to reduce violence may actually serve to increase it. And that was not a popular idea at the time. But it did lead to a lot of introspection on the part of these folks, thinking carefully about is what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis to solve this problem potentially contributing to it. This ended up leading to a gang truce, which I participated in only as an observer, and one of the priests involved in this effort pulled together a gang truce in this small community. And the fascinating experience for me was not only sitting in this room and witnessing the gang truce, but within 24 hours being called to the scene of a homicide that was carried out by people who I was just sitting with the day before, who agreed to a truce. And when we went back and questioned them later about how it was that they could have ordered this homicide of a 15-year-old boy, their answer was very simple, that this particular homicide was outside the specific parameters of the truce that they agreed to. This was a revenge killing, and they hadn't agreed not to kill this person or people he was associated with. So they had very clear lines in their minds about what they had agreed to do and what they hadn't agreed to do. I'm going to move forward. I never did a formal evaluation of that gang truce. Just sort of anecdotally, it seems to have fallen apart in pretty dramatic fashion. But we didn't do sort of a formal scientific evaluation of it. What we did do was we did a formal evaluation of another truce that I was not a participant in or an observer in the truce itself. But there was another community in Trinidad where we decided to do a formal evaluation. I mean, we were able to get data of various sorts, and it involved 8 gangs. There was sort of a little bubbling up of violence among the 8 gangs in this community. A lot of killing and shooting had gone on. And what we did is we interviewed the various people involved in this truce. We mapped out sort of the social network of gangs in this community. Once you get past 3 or 4 gangs, actually mapping out the social network of alliances and conflicts between gangs can quickly exceed your cognitive capacity. I mean, you almost need the visual to be able to map out We worked in one community, for instance, where there are 28 gangs, and my capacity to keep in mind, even though I knew these gangs really well, my capacity to keep in mind in the community with 28 gangs, who was friends and who was enemies and who was going to be retaliating against whom for what. It just 28 gangs is just too much to keep track of that. In this community with 8 gangs, I could barely fit it in my head. One of the things that we did is we put together these sociograms depicting, where solid lines depicted alliances and dashed lines depicted conflicts. And we put together one of these sociograms before the truce and after the truce. And one of the fascinating things that I found, I mean, it's sort of very easy to see visually, is that after the truce, the number of conflict or dashed lines between these 8 gangs had actually risen pretty dramatically. The truce itself had stimulated new avenues of conflict between these gangs. We very closely tracked things like gunshot wounds and reports of shootings, reports of gunshots, reports of murders, and these kinds of things. And every available form of evidence that we looked at in this community with 8 gangs suggested that the truce led to a short-term reduction in violence, maybe lasting 2 or 3 months, followed by a long-term increase in violence. And the net effect of the truce was not positive, not useful. The long-term increase in violence actually far exceeded what was there in the first place. And interviewing the participants in this truce, most of whom, by the way, are now dead from killing one another. Some were shot by the police. But the truce ended up falling apart. Somebody mentioned earlier this notion of fragility, and the gang world is a very fragile world. And gang truces are very fragile enterprises. This truce ended up falling apart over an unpaid debt of 30 Trinidad and Tobago dollars, which is the equivalent of about $5 American dollars. And so this is the level of fragility that we were dealing with there. There's some evidence from the US as well. Most of it is really bad evidence, but there is some fairly decent evidence from the LA gang truce that occurred back in '92. And this was kind of an interesting one. The researchers were physicians who worked at an LA County hospital that caught most of the homicide and shooting cases from the LA gangs. This was a level 1 trauma center. And so what they were tracking is admissions to this trauma center with gunshot wounds. So they tracked these very closely into these time series analyses. And they put out a journal article in 1993 in a medical journal, the Journal of Trauma, arguing that they had only looked at 3 months of follow-up data, and they argued that the truce led to a dramatic reduction in violence. And I can remember this line in the conclusion of this medical journal article that said, "There is hope," right? And so this is a very sort of optimistic perspective. These folks unfortunately ended up with a little bit of egg on their face when the same pattern that we found in Trinidad 20 years later, same pattern ended up revealing itself after the LA gang truce, where there ended up being a long-term increase in violence. There was that short 3-month decrease in violence. They very quickly published the article, and then that was followed by a long-term increase. A couple of years later, they ended up having to publish a follow-up article that said, "Oops, sorry." And like in Trinidad, the same pattern was found. The long-term increase in violence, there wasn't a net positive effect here. The long-term increase in violence actually sort of rose violence to new heights. And what we found in Trinidad, not just with the truce that we evaluated formally, but we watched a number of these truces. Trinidad has a 50-year history of gang truces. And we should probably learn from the past in noting that these truces virtually always end up resulting in these long-term increases in violence. What ends up, the pattern that we see, both from the LA truce and from the Trinidad truce, is a short-term increase in violence followed by a long-term, short-term decrease followed by a long-term increase. But what we know from interviewing these folks is during that decrease, imagine that somebody shoots you, or that somebody shoots somebody you love. And you have that natural instinct to retaliate. And the gang world is all about retaliation and revenge. And so when you call a truce with folks, when you call a truce with an opposing gang, this was an opposing gang that may have claimed dozens or hundreds of your pals, right? Or your relatives. And so those tensions are still simmering beneath the surface while that truce is in place. And what we found in Trinidad from interviewing these folks is when it broke really badly, because it's almost like they were able to sort of successfully keep the lid on the violence for a little while, but when it broke, it really broke hard. The El Salvador story is a little bit different because this truce has held for longer than what we've seen. And so I think we have a lot to learn from this truce. I suspect as a criminologist it's going to break like the other ones have broken, and I suspect when it breaks it's going to break badly. But what I would submit to you is the evidence that I've talked with you about today is really meager. As a social scientist, as a criminologist, I'm a little embarrassed that we don't have more to offer here, that there isn't this massive body of evidence from all over the world about what works and what doesn't work with regard to truces. And so I think El Salvador has the opportunity to teach us a lot if we're able to gain access to the data and to study it with empirical precision. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Finally, we'll turn to Alice Willman from the World Bank.
Sure. It's been wonderful to listen to you, all of you, before I give my remarks. I've been learning so much. I like attending these events because I get to learn a lot. As Jeff mentioned, I work on a team for social cohesion and violence prevention in the World Bank. Most of my work is in Central America and East Asia. And so as part of that, I have the opportunity to work quite a bit on El Salvador. And in terms of the truce, I think it's safe to say that we, the World Bank, along with most donors, all donors that I know of, share the same concerns. A lot of the concerns that have been raised here, a lot of the questions, there are a lot of questions around the truce, and personally I don't think we're ever going to have answers to most of those questions. It's a very uncertain process, and it's not a foundation that we can really build on. That said, I think, and there are some pieces of it that are fundamental that aren't there. For example, the private sector is completely against it, not part of it at all, despite some of the proclamations that have been made from high levels in government. Public opinion is not crazy about it either, despite the fact that many of the youth have been in the press and framed it in a way that you would think would shift public opinion a bit. It hasn't been. So, and the bottom line, as Stephen mentioned, is that extortion hasn't stopped. And that is really what affects the daily lives of most people in El Salvador. There are entire family economies that are built around extortion. It's not just a matter of a couple of guys going and extorting a few people and then going to buy, whatever they buy with it. There are mothers and sisters and children that rely on this economy. And that, for us, as development actors, that's a huge challenge. Because whatever development program we try to put in place has to deal with that. Has to figure out what that economy is, how it functions, and how we can insert ourselves in a positive way to change the incentive structure around it. So but again, all those uncertainties and questions about the truce, after putting those out there, we do see it as an opportunity. I mean, it's given Salvadoran society a chance to breathe, to really stand back and reflect a bit on decades, going back to the war and maybe even before, of a social fabric that's been torn apart by the legacies of violence. So this is an important moment, and I think everybody wants to take advantage of it. And the last time I was in El Salvador was a few weeks ago, and I had the opportunity to meet with Mijango. We didn't get to meet with Colines. And we also met with, and we're launching a project, by the way, on youth employment there that's working with UNDP and Catholic Relief Services and the Chambers of Commerce. That's meant to hook youth up with opportunities in the private sector, entrepreneurship opportunities, and then also employment opportunities in the public sector. And so through the process of that, we met with the representatives of the MS-13 and the 18th Street gangs. Not the leaders are in jail, but they have representatives that they designate to be spokespeople, and they meet all over the place actually. They're in the news a lot. And their job, as they described it to us, was they've been going from municipality to municipality, kind of selling the truce to the people that gang-involved youth. And their perspective was fascinating. From one thing, they were saying that the truce has a lot of buy-in. All of us are skeptical about how much buy-in there really is on the ground. Their discourse, of course, is that there's a lot of buy-in, especially among older gang members. The younger ones, as we know, we've all been young, tend to be more hotheads, and also haven't seen yet the benefits of being in a gang. They also haven't suffered as much from being in a gang. So they don't really necessarily see the point yet. Older members have been in there longer, they've suffered a lot more, and they have more to gain from the truce, frankly. So there's that sort of generational divide. The other issue of it was that this has been, of course I'm the woman on the panel, so I have to bring up the gender dimensions. It's a very gender-blind process. It gives you the impression when you read the press about it that this is just a fight between a bunch of men, and that women aren't involved in this at all. And we all know that women are involved, and it's not been a positive experience for most of them in this. And there's nothing in the truce, nothing in the dialogue, nothing in what's going on the ground that I've seen that is meant to address those impacts and the role of women in all this. So that's a piece that I think we definitely have to work on with them. When we spoke with them, they framed it, as has been raised before on this panel, as a social inclusion issue. And this to me was very interesting because in the World Bank we work obviously in all of our member countries. We do a lot of work on post-conflict reintegration of ex-combatants. Some of that experience is, I think, relevant to El Salvador. And it's always a question of reintegration. That's the word we use, which tends to mean you take these people who have been involved in violence and you try to rehabilitate them in some way to make them fit back into society. But in El Salvador and in most societies, it's more than that. It's a process of not just them learning how to be in civilian life, so to speak, but it's a process of Salvadoran society making space for people that have been excluded in very drastic ways for their entire lives and for generations. That's not to say that they haven't done terrible things that people need to be accountable for, but I think, another comment I heard today in terms of the victimizers and victims, there's no victim, or there's no victimizer that hasn't also been a victim at some point. And there's a cycle there that we have to be clear about, I think, when we're addressing this. So in terms of how development actors have looked at this, I mentioned the Youth Employment Project that we have. We also did a public expenditure review of the security sector in El Salvador. And a public expenditure review is something that we do in countries where we're trying to stimulate a dialogue, or maybe there's just beginning to be a dialogue about crime and violence and security. And it's just a review of the money trail. We look at the budget and we get data from all the different institutions and we figure out where the money is going, where it's being spent. And that tells you about priorities. You can look at the discourse, but when you have it in front of you in black and white, these are the numbers. And they're pretty stark in El Salvador. This is actually going to be a public document soon. It's launching at our spring meetings in a couple of weeks. And after that, in May, we're starting a series of meetings in El Salvador around it, to have dialogue around it, with the idea of getting different working groups together with representatives of the different government ministries to come up with actual action plans to implement around crime and violence prevention. Because you probably know there's a national strategy on prevention in El Salvador, and there's a prevention cabinet that's been formed. There's a vice ministry of prevention that sits under the Ministry of Security. But anybody will tell you, despite working on that strategy, that it's not an implementable, is that a word? It's not a strategy that is ready to be implemented. The implementation plan is not there. It hasn't been costed. It's not clear, what the marching orders are going to be of the different institutions. So we're trying to work on that. In the public expenditure review, some of the findings that matter, El Salvador has one of the lowest levels of public spending in general in the region. It's only 22% of GDP, and the regional average is 28%. Most of that budget is pretty rigid because it goes to wages and salaries. So there's not, when you have a crisis or you have something you need to respond to, there's not as much wiggle room as you would have in other places. In terms of security sector, only 3% of spending in the security sector goes toward prevention. 97% goes toward control. That means policing, and it's mostly policing in prisons, actually. 45% is policing of what goes toward control. So that's your mano dura legacy. And so despite the dialogue on prevention, which is a positive thing, we have to really think about where the money is going and try to shift that. Most of the work and the interventions on prevention are funded by donors. And those are, there's donors doing great things. There's no national system to map that money and the activities that are being funded by it, and keeping track of what donors are doing. That's another thing that the donors are trying to work on as well, but there's no system to really, for the government to be able to know what money is coming in and who's doing what. And so as a result, you have, you know, some municipalities getting a bunch of money, other municipalities not getting as much. Some donors are going toward these municipalities that are covered under the Truce. Others are going under the National Pact for Security and Unemployment, which is a whole different set of municipalities. And so it's kind of there's a serious need for coordination. There's also a need for coordination within the ministries of the government. I mean, as I mentioned, there is a prevention cabinet. There's also a security cabinet. They have mostly different ministries under them, and under the security cabinet is all the ones you would expect. You know, that's where the military is. That's the sort of the harder side of things. The prevention has social development, education, health, and they meet pretty regularly, but again, not a clear plan yet on how to coordinate their activities across different ministries. So there's some serious challenge, but I think we can safely say that this dialogue is important. The fact that the nation is talking about this, the fact that it's being framed often as a social inclusion issue is a good opportunity. The fact that there's a conversation about reprioritizing, even if that hasn't translated into changing where the money goes yet, is important. The fact that there's a conversation about coordination is also important. And I think in terms of, you know, translating some lessons from other places, if we think about especially the DDR processes, so that's disarmament, oh, I always forget, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration processes that we've worked on. And it's a problem when you think in acronyms all the time. I can't remember what they really stand for. What we've learned from them is that short-term, that things like truces and peace agreements and reintegration programs are short-term solutions. They're important, they're critical. They get people out of uniform, they get people to lay down their guns, and they get people talking, but they can't last more than a few years. We've seen it in Colombia, we've seen it all over Africa, that if the economy doesn't shift, if the public dialogue doesn't shift, if public spending doesn't shift towards something that creates more opportunities, then they can't hold. They can't be expected. A process like a truce can't be expected to last long term. So I think as we come up on a year of this and we're running into elections in El Salvador, this is the critical time to start thinking, you know, what is the plan for sustaining these gains and for really contributing to the sustainable kind of prevention that we want to see, so this can actually see some change over the long term.
Great, thank you very much. So we'll open this up for questions, just a couple of quick summaries. One, I think it's really important to emphasize, we heard in several different speakers, important to understand the complexity of poor and working class neighborhoods in El Salvador, particularly the suburbs around the city, and to understand young people and gang members as both victimizers and victims, and keeping both those perspectives is important, I think. We heard a lot about the fragility of the truce, about who's been involved in brokering the truce, about the moral authority that will help generate the public support to make this process move forward and become sustainable. A lot of questions from comparative experiences, both kind of in other countries on gangs as well as DDR sort of experiences about whether processes like this are sustainable and what you can do about that. I would just emphasize, I think WOL is particularly concerned that the negotiations, the brokering that led to the truce may have caused some real collateral damage in weakening the police and criminal justice system, and that for us is a major and ongoing concern. And sort of finally, despite all that, the opportunities that may exist to invest in communities and take advantage of the situation if you can get the leadership and if you can develop a real and meaningful plan. And I think those are our major challenges looking forward. I would also, as a last comment, be remiss if I didn't say that WOL and the IDB have worked on share this concern about donor coordination.
Yeah,
there's a lot of money in the donor community for Central America overall, and El Salvador in particular. Very little of it is effectively coordinated, and you'll see, the example I keep using is USAID and German GIC both invest in community-based violence prevention. And until recently, neither knew the other was doing it. Neither had ever talked to the other about what communities they were focusing on, what methodologies they use, or what research they based any of this on. And so we, with the IDB, did an initial mapping study that looks at donor contributions to Central America. It's on our website and on the IDB's as well, and maybe a tool for some of us moving forward. So after that little commercial, Susan, we have a lot of questions here. So Susan, okay, Brent, Chris, let's just start there and we'll keep going.
Good morning.
Can everybody identify themselves?
Sure. My name is Susan Cruz. I'm originally from Salvador, and I've been working on this topic, for the past 15 years of my life. I was just in Salvador last week, and I really appreciate, that at least now there's a little bit more of the conversation where some folks can't see the forest for the trees, but I really appreciate when you pointed out about gender. But I do have some specific questions. There are some players in the private sector in El Salvador, that are, beginning to open up to the idea of, what's going to happen, beyond the truth. Violence, has been, is, and will continue to be a problem in El Salvador. This is part of its culture, and that, changing culture is something that takes place over the long term. But folks in the private sector and folks also in, in Salvadoran society in general and in the diaspora are really opening up, to how can we work together? How do we develop strategies that work? And with that said, with what you call DDR. I think it's important to have some thought-provoking conversation about what that looks like for gang members. Gang members are not, they work from an organized militia type group. And so the gangs also have, to be put, on notice that the ball is in their court about how they need to develop, something and put it to paper and put their word on it as to what that looks like. Because if people are wanting to lead a gang lifestyle, but they don't have a way, to do it, and it's not a formalized process that society can recognize and accept, then we are going nowhere. We're spinning our wheels. The second thing, and this is something that I would like to ask, in terms of how other players can be involved in developing strategies. One of the things that I have noticed that has really worked in other parts of other problems in El Salvador is the diaspora, particularly hometown associations. They would like to be very much involved. However, I know that one of the things that's driving where resources are going to be allocated, and something that's really driving a lot of the funding, particularly the U.S. side, is the U.S. Treasury's designation of MS-13 as an organized crime. And so there's a lot of people in El Salvador who are saying, well, we can't work with them anyways because the U.S. won't let us. So what are your thoughts, as to how people can sort of either work around that or address it, and because it is an elephant in the room.
Let's take a couple of questions and then give everybody a chance to answer. Brent? Oh,
Sorry about me? Sorry.
yeah.
So my question is sort of on a similar parallel, but basically you talk about reintegration and this sort of equating this to a peace process in a lot of ways, and how this DDR process could unfold. But really the political realities are very different, and I'm curious both from the historical perspective that you brought up, Ed, in terms of how this has gone on in the past, and what you see as the political realities on the ground and the actual political will to see this unfold on the gang side of things. Do they actually want to no longer be gangs? I don't see any evidence to indicate to me that they want to get rid of their enterprises. You discussed they're very much still continuing with their extortions and other lucrative parts of their business. So I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on both this historical side of it from you, Ed, and in specific context of El Salvador. Is there really political will on the gang sides to unfold, and how does that actually happen with gang truce versus a FARC being a political entity?
Okay, great. Let me, Chris, and then let's do Chris, and then we'll do a round of answers. Then we'll come back.
Hi, I'm Chris Ashley. I work on Central American Security in the State Department in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. My question, and I won't try to be preachy with the speech, but whose truce is this? What seems critical, and it may be completely lacking in El Salvador, is for the average citizen, what do they really gain? A lot of the homicides were gang on gang, so the gang actually has more stability to conduct its operations. So the people who live in these communities that are truces, what do they really have? They have a gang that has to worry less about being killed by another gang, and they can focus on their core operations and the criminal operations. And there's always the threat of perceived fear. And in the State Department, at least, we talk about citizen security. And a large part of that, we say safe streets. But it's citizens being able, with confidence, to go on your street and not worry about your kids being hit by a bullet or being extorted on the bus ride. So in El Salvador, has there been this buy-in? It seems like very little engagement with the people who are on the streets to make this sustainable, because it seems, from my perception, the sustainability a key component is, in fact, citizens feeling like they're a part of the process, which they weren't to start, and that the truce actually benefits them. And how important is trying to get civil society engagement? And in other truces you've looked at are DDR opportunities. Can you bring in civil society a year later and then make them part of what they perceive as a non-inclusive process?
Okay, I think there's probably questions for everybody here in this process. Alice, you want to start, and then we'll just go down.
Sure, thank you. Now, I really hope I haven't implied that sort of this truce is a peace process of any type, that this is really a DDR process. It's not, it's very different. What I meant to say is that there are lessons from countries that have undergone peace processes, including El Salvador, that can loosely apply, perhaps, and that's where we've had some experience. But it's not a peace agreement. There is no peace agreement. There's no, as you mentioned, there's no formal way to leave a gang. There's no, okay, I'm out now. Now I get my package of, training and my civilian uniform and my, whatever. That's not happening, and that is why that's another reason why it's fragile, and I think that's another reason why it has to be a process that goes beyond the gangs. This is a social process that's involving everybody in society, and even though the truce, because the truce is one thing, but civil society was not involved in the truce in the beginning. If you count Colindres, but as Stephen mentioned, he's a military priest. He doesn't even necessarily represent all priests, and from El Faro's expose on the truce, they had to go and look for it took them a while to find a priest that would buy into this and be part of it. He was not their first choice. So there wasn't a lot of buy-in in the beginning, and that's why public opinion is still very much questioning this process and even against it, even after a year, because I think there's a concern that El Salvador could follow the path of Trinidad and LA and see the cohesion of these gangs increase and see the legitimacy increase and see them solidify. I haven't seen anything that says that they're going to demobilize at all. So that is a serious concern. I think the other concern too is that this is the parameters of the truce. It hasn't been clear to me whether this truce applies beyond gang-on-gang homicide. No one has said, to my knowledge, maybe you've seen it, but no one has said that, okay, we're not going to kill anybody anymore, or we're going to stop extorting. Now, the municipalities under the truce, that is supposed to be what happens in those municipalities. Those are supposed to be all gang activity stopped, but we haven't seen it yet. And so for the average person walking down the street, you still have a risk of being hurt or robbed or extorted. So I think this is the kind of conversation that needs to be happening, and especially bringing in the civil society, given that the civil society organizations on the ground are the ones that have been most involved for decades in this. They know the communities, they know the dynamics of the gang. They don't have the same divisions of, oh, he's a gang member and he's not. They understand people as people, and they know how to work there. So in our project, for example, we're trying to work, that's why we're working with Catholic Relief Services, that's why we're working with the Chamber of Commerce, to get the private sector involved in there. And how the project works is the Chamber of Commerce does a market study just to identify what they call empresas tractoras, which are basically companies that could be government agencies or private companies that need goods and services provided to them. And then they work with groups of youth to start businesses that provide those goods and services, or to help train them for jobs inside those bigger companies. So the idea is to build them around the local economies, so that you have something that's sustainable, because there's nothing worse than employment training that doesn't link up to employment, and we see that all over the place. And also so that you have things that are happening inside the local communities, because often, even if a youth from a very stigmatized, gang-dominated community can get a job, he or she can't get transport home at night because the buses won't go there. So we have to really try to build it around there, and I won't say we've fixed it yet, but we're working on it. But these are important areas.
Great. Steve, comments?
Just quickly on the gang's will to take part in this. I guess for us at Inside Crime, one of the things that has been a really, big surprise is that we thought that these organizations were much flatter that their hierarchy was weak, that they were a little bit more unstable than what they've turned out to be, that their ability to hold this together for a year tells us a lot about their structures themselves, and that they actually do have some ability and some command over their lower echelon members. So, you know, that's the sort of good side of the gang will. So if you continue to have gang will from the top, I think that you possibly have a chance. And the older members, as was mentioned, the older members are interested in this, obviously for different reasons than younger members. The bad of that is obviously you've got organizations that, as the Treasury Department has tried to point out, I think erroneously at this point, but perhaps maybe projecting a little bit in the future, is that when you have this type of hierarchical structure and ability to control large amounts of territory and soldiers and whatnot, you have an ability to branch out into different types of criminal activities that become perhaps even more dangerous and destabilizing than your run-of-the-mill extortion, which is how most of these gangs make their money right now. So you've got the sort of good and bad of the hierarchies, and the gangs will, I think, at this point, still to a certain extent, fortunately, depends on the leaders. Now, I don't, you know, one of the main problems with this process has been this complete lack of transparency on the part of the government and the actors involved, and so we need to know more about that. We need to put more on the table and sort of figure out what the motivations are behind all this. And then with regard to civil society engagement, I think that the path that Alice pointed out is crucial. I mean, Catholic Relief Services, for example, isn't just doing programs with gang members. They're doing it in communities, on a community level, and this is critical. I mean, it has to include the entire community. You know, the guy who's been trying to receive a microloan for his, you know, for his bread shop for 10 years needs to get that, you know, just as much as the gang member who just came out and said, you know what, I'm actually not a gang member anymore. So you need to be able to balance off those needs of the entire community, and I think that things such as Catholic Relief Services, which would be the one that I know the best, are very good examples of integrating entire communities. But so far, civil society engagement has been minimal to none, and so I would agree with that criticism also of the Truce thus far.
Before, just another quick commercial. If we can work out the scheduling, the CRS Latin American director will probably be here to speak in about 2 weeks about their project and what they're doing with local businesses and job creations. We'll let people know. Yeah.
Just a quick criminological perspective on this idea of reintegration. Non-gang experts have this tendency, I've noticed, to view gangs as being homogeneous. But if you've studied gangs at any depth, and this is over place and time, I think this holds, gangs are intensely heterogeneous, both gangs as entities and gang members. And so when we look at gang violence, for instance, some gangs are really violent, and other gangs are not particularly violent. Some gangs carry out a lot of violent offenses. Some gangs are the recipient of lots of violent offenses, and some gangs are simply not involved in violence. Same thing, we see the same pattern when we look at gang members, individual people, that usually it's a pretty small number of people within a gang who carry out acts of violence. And usually the level of commitment to a gang varies pretty intensely within gangs and across gangs. And so this question of sort of reintegration and can we rescue certain, I suspect there are probably quite a few people in gangs who we're not going to rescue. That's not going to happen. It's just not realistic. It's naive. But I also think there are a lot of people who are involved in gangs who we can rescue, particularly younger gang members, particularly gang members in gangs that aren't as committed to violence. We see a lot of younger sort of experimental gangs just sort of bubbling up. I think these folks are still rescuable with the right type of outreach. These sort of folks who have a long history of carrying out acts of violence, I think that's where the justice sector needs to come in maybe more than the prevention sector. Thanks.
I think for Chris' question, it's pretty safe to say that as for now, the Truce is owned by the gang leadership and by the brokers. So far, it's like that. Probably what started as an ownership by the leadership in the jails has somewhat transcended to the leadership in the streets, and this has to do with the the way that leadership works at the gangs. Because as if we take what we know, the little that we know from how the pact was done, it was done in talks that started between the state agents, meaning Mijango and his crowd, and the leadership station at Zacatras. Some in Barrios, other ones in Chalate, Izalco. And what these guys had was the capacity of their ward. Their ward had power over the whole structure. That we know now. There were doubts about that. There and here, in the cliques, MS and Barrio 18 cliques here. But now we know that they had that capacity. We're going to go with this. And what's this? We won't kill anymore. Who? We won't kill. We won't kill each other. Period. So Mijango and some religious leader came to know this because of previous talks and experience. So they thought they knew that they could break a deal there, and they started from there, and they owned the pact from there. I understand that there were a lot of doubts in the street leadership. Keep in mind that these are 2 generations apart, and probably the leadership in the street, in the barrios, is different, and some cliques leadership, they didn't own a lot of loyalty to Viejolín or Chino Tres Colas or Diablito de Hollywood, these guys. But what we learned is that the way that leadership had worked for 25 years still worked. La palabra had power. So, but that, if it transcended to the street leadership in order to get the thing working, that instruction, not killing, neither our homies or the other guys, that was it. So they had that power, but also they were clear about the other thing. Because that's what the leadership in the street asked. Okay, good enough, but we are providing for you. We're the ones giving you money to sustain you in jail, your families, and paying for your lawyers. What do you want us to do? Keep it. Keep doing business. That was clear. So that was the pact. And that was, again, that's what is at the core of it. That is what's happening again, and no one's changing that. So extortion again is going and going and going in the streets. So that's what I think is that is the main reason, because Salvadoran population doesn't believe in this, because that's what they're feeling. Fear is due to, hey, I need to go out there. If I make, I don't know, $300 a month, I gotta take 60 out to give to these guys monthly. And if I don't do that, I will be hurt. Me, my family, my kids. So that's fear. That's the rule of fear. So that's why this truce is not owned by anyone else. And that goes to the other question. Do these guys don't want to be gangs anymore? I don't think they want to be something else. That's everything they know. That's everything they have been doing all their lives. So in order to transcend that, what you need is to take the process out of there, where the family's out. The gender thing is very important here, because it's very common that they're extorting each other, because the family networks living in these neighborhoods are themselves, their families, and there's what the whole thing about plans, financing, giving opportunities to the people that are actually living in these neighborhoods makes sense. But you don't do that. I mean, Raúl Mijango, Fabio Colindres, Chino Trescolas, these guys, they don't have neither the will nor the capacity to do this. This is for the state of El Salvador, civil society, and the private sector to do. So that's why I keep saying, in order to transcend this stage, you need all these actors to step in and put together an alternative. As for now, you don't have an alternative. What you have is Chino Trescolas, Viejolín, putting out la palabra, saying, we will keep going with this, right? And what's that? What's the plan? We won't be killing, but we will keep doing what we do, because that's our only means for survival. And we don't have any alternative. I mean, I'm not trying to say that's good, that's bad. That's what it is. And if without any alternative to that, what we have is a truce, a fragile truce that will end the moment one of these guys, in or out, says, well, that's it.
Okay, we're running out of time here, but we do have an ultimate round here of questions. So 2 people in the front row, you sir, and Claire, and then we'll do you, and then we'll wrap up, all right? Okay, go.
Jerry Little from USAID. I guess my question really goes to the basic premise of, or the way this conversation was framed was around the gang truce being effective in reducing homicides. And I'd like to put it to you, how do we know that it's been effective? How reliable is the data? How do we know it hasn't been politicized? And how do we know that there just aren't more people lying in shallow graves?
Good question.
Okay. My question is very, very simple. Who is against the truth? Who doesn't want the truth?
That's not simple at all.
Besides the young population that has been extorted, but I'm talking about the top of the society, the owners of the country are against or in favor. That's my question.
My question is, I think, I'm sorry, Jonathan Nellis from the State Department. I was struck when the State Department recently released a travel warning that there was actually commentary and rhetoric that came out of the gangs that was very political in nature. And one of the questions I'd like to put to you is do you see this process eventually leading to kind of an elevation of the gangs to political actors and possibly taking these unrepentant criminal enterprises and having that potentially weaken some of the democratic institutions in El Salvador?
Claire?
Okay, just a quick question. For the money they promised the municipalities free from violence, I had heard that maybe the IDB money was being reprogrammed to do some of that to support some of those municipalities. And am I wrong? I might be completely wrong. I was just curious if the World Bank representative knew that. And if the OAS is behind this, are they the only multilateral that's out there in front? And the other question, and yeah, that's all.
Okay, last question.
Shannon Callahan, I'm a doctoral candidate over at Georgetown University in international relations. What is the role, or what should be the role of U.S. security assistance, such as programs like the Central America Regional Security Initiative, in reducing violence or at least reducing gang membership?
Question
Okay.
for you, Chris.
Great. So with that last round of questions, I guess we'll start again, give our speakers a last quick chance to respond, and then let everybody go.
I can only, those are questions, all of them questions that I share. And I hope, I would love to know the answers to them. In terms of whether donor money is going toward the municipalities and the truce, I don't think so. I mean, it might have changed, but my understanding is that there are things being said and announcements being made, but as far as I know, it's a bit of a separate process. The donors tend to have their municipalities that we all focus on, and those don't always coincide with the truce municipalities. And the only thing I can say about the OAS is that the Secretary General of the OAS did meet with the gang leaders in prison recently, so they've gone a step further, I think, than most donors. Most donors are watching it with a lot of caution and seeing the opportunities that it provides, but we haven't really been invited to support the truce, and it doesn't necessarily make sense for us to support the truce directly, so we're not.
Steve.
Homicides. There's police data, there's forensic medicine data,
They're not too far apart. They're showing significant declines. And then there is the reporting of, for me, the 3 journalists who have been reporting about this from the beginning, who have been closest to this, and those would be the guys from El Faro and the Sala Negra. And I put the same questions to them, and they say, look, it's real. I mean, are we going to know for sure how real it is? I mean, absolute, like, precise numbers? No, but I think it's real enough, I guess would be my answer to that. Real enough, and certainly there are shallow graves, there are a lot more, there are disappearances, but they can't account for this large drop. So, you know, I don't believe that they're exact, but I believe that they're real enough. As far as who's against the truce, I think that that's a difficult way to frame it. I think that everyone is for lowering homicides. And I think that that's what they're looking at. I'm not going to be against the truce because, I mean, I want homicides to go down. I'm going to be against the truce, again, if I'm the local guy who's been waiting for my microloan for 10 years from the IDB, and all of a sudden the IDB passes it off to this guy who says, I'm no longer a gang member. I mean, that's the guy who's going to be against the truce. I mean, in my mind, those are the people to worry about. And then, of course, you've got the sort of elite sector, but that's, to a certain extent, why the church was brought in, and the OAS as well. The OAS is brokering certainly channels through which the elite can hopefully channel some money in a positive way. But Menendez pointed out, this is a state that has had a history of not putting money in the right direction. So, you know, they're going to be asking a lot from the international donor community. I think it's unrealistic to think the international donor community is going to fill that gap. And I think that that's a dangerous thing to go, dangerous direction to go. And then the gangs as political actors, I don't think there's any question that they are and will remain political actors, but I don't think that they're going to create a political party. I think what they're going to do is much more along the lines of what we saw in Jamaica, where they're going to play a role in gathering votes, play a role in creating, you know, strong coalitions or political bodies, and even play a role in the actual elections themselves. In other words, if you don't have X gang member on your side, it's the same as if you don't have this pastor on your side, and if you don't have, you know, the other, you know, sort of local community leader on your side. It's going to be that sort of role. That's what I see for the gangs in the future. And then U.S. security initiative stuff, I would urge the doctoral candidate, I think it was, to talk to all these guys right here in the middle. Okay, they can certainly talk to you more about what role the United States should play in creating security, you know, citizen security programs.
I'll just take the one piece, the one question about can the process elevate the gangs, and I think absolutely. What I think we know from gangs in other places is that increasing gang cohesion and increasing the legitimacy of gangs can plant the long-term, the seeds for long-term increases in violence. We can see, I was struck by one of the speakers who mentioned that the gangs had appointed spokespeople. You know, I mean, this is very organized and very scary to me as a criminologist that the gangs have spokespeople. And yeah, I have this memory of sitting at the hotel bar in Trinidad one night after having interviewed a gang leader, and looking up at the television, and there's a half-hour news special on the guy I just interviewed. And in the news special, he's talking about how he just returned from Parliament, where he had been talking with some of the members of Parliament. And not too long after that, I was reading news articles about both the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's wife meeting with gang leaders. All of this led me to write a letter to the Minister of National Security saying, my very strong advice to you is, in whatever dealings your nation has with gang leaders, you appoint low-level functionaries to handle those meetings. These folks should not be meeting with senior government officials. We should not be seeing them on the evening news in these half-hour news specials. This is just craziness, because what you're doing is you're elevating them in the eyes of their communities. They perceive themselves, they describe themselves as community leaders. their communities describe them as community leaders. If you have any doubts about this, just look at the funerals of slain gang leaders, and some of these funerals are like the funerals of a slain movie star or a politician. These are just sort of crazy. There's this sort of Robin Hood persona among gang leaders in many areas, and we can't be feeding into that as governments or as NGOs. We can't be feeding into that. And so anything we do that increases that cohesion, increases that legitimacy, I think we need to worry about.
Great, Hector, you have the last word.
Well, I think that something we've learned with this whole process is precisely how gangs work, and I think it's very important to understand how mixed they are and how different levels they have, and it's very important to differentiate between leadership in the jails and the leadership outside. That these spokespersons, the ones I've seen in press reports or that I have talked to, are mostly young guys from the community, that are identified with gang values. Most of them haven't committed serious crimes. Probably they're engaged in some, probably drug dealing, minor endeavors, but they're well recognized as community leaders. They're outspoken. They're trusted by the community. I'm not saying just by the clique or the gang, but by the community. So you might have potential there. What do you do with that? Well, again, that's something you can work with. Young people in their 20s, most of them have high school education. That's one level. The guys in jail, I mean, I really identify with what you're saying. The first time I saw these guys, when the whole Truce thing started, when I was a young reporter, I remember covering these guys. I mean, seeing these guys now, 3 of them, sitting there as, the new peacekeepers and the new, kind of national heroes. I remember one of them covering him when I was a young reporter, as I said. This guy killed 21 people, 21 human beings. Hey, I agree. I mean, there's a whole social process around him. He was victimized, but he's a criminal. I mean, he killed 21 persons. I don't want my country talking to him as a leader. Probably he has a role to play here, because he has something to say to the gang about this. I don't want him to be the face of this. And the other guy, he killed 2, but he's known by the police to be one of the main contacts between Guatemalan and Salvadoran drug traffickers. So there are levels. Again, probably it was needed. These guys were needed for this process to start. When's the time to take them out of this? Because there's another level of leadership out there. Because the gang is not just one homogeneous thing, as you said, And the gang is a reality out there. I mean, keep in mind that these territories have not known the Salvadoran state for decades, haven't had social services for decades. And the gang has provided some sort of authority there, a twisted, of course, authority. But this new generation might represent some, if you read this piece on Ilopango, the most positive figure there is one of these gang spokesperson. There is this young guy, and all he talks about is his worriness about how to sell this, chicken harvest they have in a farm. to the local supermarket, and that story has to do with the private sector. They want to sell this to the local supermarket, the main supermarket chain in El Salvador, owned by one of the richest families. Are they opposed? The Callejas, Super Selectos. Are they opposed to this? They don't care. Because, you know, truce doesn't mean anything to them. I mean, they could buy this chicken harvest. That's peanuts for them. But since it doesn't touch their interest, not economic, they would care if it would mean something politically. If this would hurt their political allies at some point, they would care. If it doesn't, they don't care. That's what I think. That's what I think. And as for the figures, there were some doubts at the beginning, but despite the doubts, I think the drop is so big that, you know, from 12, 13 to 5, 6, that's half. So I think there's no question about that.
Let me just, last comment, we got a couple of Twitter questions. One of them had to do with differences between gangs and this leadership of the street and leadership in the prisons, whether the police might be able to exploit that in terms of going after demobilizing gangs. A couple of people touched on that in different ways. Just because of time, I don't want to go through it again. The other question we got was background material and readings on the gang and truce issues in El Salvador, and I think more generally. And again, I don't want to make everybody run through that here, but we'll try and put some of that stuff together. We have some of it. We can get, I think, some of the comparative stuff from Ed, and we'll put it up on our website and make it available to people. So I would just wrap up by saying thank you to everyone. I think one important thing to emphasize is a series of criticisms about how the truce was negotiated, who was involved, what other kinds of deals, a lot of questions and uncertainties all of us have about it and about its fragility and its sustainability. It's a fact. And I think one of the, whether it should have been done this way, a lot of people think it shouldn't, it's a fact. And sort of the challenge that faces Salvadoran government, Salvadoran civil society, and the international community more largely is to figure out, given the situation we have, how to try and move forward in a way that's constructive for the rule of law and for social inclusion both. And that's a real challenge. So I think we'll just end on that note. Thank you all. He's going to be and I actually because it's I mean, it's good.